Hello YouTube. Today I'll talk to you about information from the newspaper called Krasnaya Zvezda, or Red Star, which was the official newspaper of the Soviet Armed Forces and is the official newspaper of the Russian Armed Forces today. Very interesting publication, and sometimes they reveal information about UFOs and USOs which are of great interest. Not a lot, but quite interesting information. So when you speak about disclosures and information that has recently appeared in the United States, keep in mind that for years some of such information has been available in Russia as well. And I will just go through the Russian language materials and I translate as I speak to you, so you have the freshest of the information, and at the same time I'm able to present it to you as quickly as I collect it. And one of the interesting cases revealed by Krasnaya Zvezda was information about the Rear Admiral Yuri Kwiatkowski, a very interesting gentleman, and has a great military experience. He told the newspaper that in February of 1972, while in the Northern Fleet area, he was a commander of a submarine, and they were on the battle watch. In one of the regions, he doesn't mention which one, but it was in one of the regions the submarine surfaced because they needed to get in touch with the main headquarters, also to charge their batteries, to get rid of the garbage, to vent the submarine, and so forth. So when the submarine surfaced, he saw the following picture. At the level of the horizon, over the water, they saw a opaque, oval, bright orange stain or spot. Nobody could determine what it was. Not the captain, of the submarine, not the first mate. So they thought that maybe there is a disaster somewhere nearby. Maybe one of the vessels is sinking. So they decided to submerge and go to that direction. And the Soviet submarine, it took them about half an hour to go, in the submerged position towards that spot, bright orange spot, at the speed of about 12 knots. They surfaced and observed the same picture. It was the same object at the same distance from them. They submerged again, moved another hour to the same direction. They surface, and the Soviet commander sees that it's the same UFO at the same distance from them. They couldn't determine what it was, and they never talked about it. He says they never actually wrote down anything. They didn't want to have unnecessary issues. But while he was on shore and talked to his comrades who commanded similar submarines, they found out that in the same area, the same phenomenon was observed by other Soviet submariners. What they mention is that while they were watching this UFO, they felt very unusual, very dark feelings, negative emotions. So that was revealed by Rear Admiral Kwiatkowski. Another interesting story that was published in Krasnaya Zvezda, and information was given to them by Alexander Evgenievich Semyonov, who is a very unusual person and who has worked in one of the most secret military facilities of the Soviet Union and Russia. Let me tell you a little bit more about him so you know who we're speaking to and why we should listen to him. He began his ufological UFO research work in the Ziegel-Kuzovkin group. Felix Ziegel was the top Soviet UFO researcher, and Kuzovkin, Alexander Kuzovkin, was also well known, who died tragically, who destroyed his own archives of UFOs, by the way, and but not all of them. Some information came out through the years, and whose observations of some of the notes I've used in my research, including the observation of the gigantic 10-story building-like wheel that was observed by Soviet scientists in the Black Sea. Now, back to Semyonov. He was very active in the Soviet UFO field after the fall of the Soviet Union. He is also an academician in several academies, and due to his input in the Soviet space programs and projects, he was given one of the highest orders, I should say, or awards from the from the Russian Federal Space Agency in 2009. He is also very active in the so-called Ziegel readings. This is the Russian UFO conference, which takes place annually. He's written books. He's been on Russian television quite a lot. So this is a very interesting and knowledgeable person. So let's listen to what he says. According to him, according to Semyonov, he cannot say that UFOs are actually manifestation of the extraterrestrial intellect. He thought that that's what that's what it was, that the UFOs were signs of the extraterrestrial presence. In the middle of the 1970s of the 20th century, for example, when the Soviet ufology was becoming more active but still forbidden, a lot of Russian UFO researchers believed that this was the only explanation that there could be, that it was the extraterrestrial civilizations that visited us. However, after he attended lectures of Felix Ziegel, who I already mentioned, Semyonov changed his mind. So for him, for example, in the presence, the term flying saucers, all it means is that there are unidentified objects, maybe some physical formations, but that's about it. At the same time, Semyonov believes, and listen to him because he knows what he's talking about, he believes that the UFOs are definitely a danger to the mankind. Maybe just because they're not researched well enough, unidentified, and science doesn't know what they are. And Semyonov brings up the episode which I mentioned in my books and lectures too, when Stalin, the Soviet dictator, once invited Sergei Korolev, who was the father of this Soviet space science, and to Kremlin and showed him a bunch of photographs showing the German ultimate weapon, V7 developments. Also disc-like flying objects which work on different principles, and he wanted to find out if they present any threat for the Soviet Union. And in this version, just like what I told you, after detailed research of the materials, the Soviet designer came to a conclusion that at this point of development, this UFO or whatever was presented to him do not present danger to the Soviet Union. So that's another confirmation of the information I got from Burdakov. But Semyonov mentioned something else. That has to do with the Vietnam War. And he's being a little bit vague about it. I've heard other stories, but he says that one of the sides in that war in Southeast Asia, that's how he puts it, tried to shoot down some flying objects using rays, directed rays. This weapon could vaporize everything else on Earth, but the weapon that was used by the UFOs actually vaporized everything else down below in that country in Southeast Asia. It's a very interesting episode, and I had different variants of that story. But let's go back to Semyonov. He mentioned Project Trust. He says that back in the Soviet times, a Soviet scientist whose last name was Avramenko wanted to find out why is it that UFOs fly noiselessly, not creating any sound waves. And he concluded that around such objects there is a layer of called plasma, which moves it through the air, and there is no turbulence or any noise. But how can you practically use such an effect? So apparently a group of Soviet scientists developed an emitter, something that emits, which could change the atmosphere, the parameters of the atmosphere, by heating up the air. This was very interesting because this invention could have been used for the needs of the Soviet defense industry. All that was needed, according to Semyonov, was $300 million to realize this project. So they decided actually to get Americans involved. And according to Semyonov, the Americans listened to the Soviet offers but politely refused to cooperate. And then he says 7 years later, the HARP system was created, which was working on the same principles. And then he revealed more information about aliens and humanoids and so forth. And his reply to the question whether he believes in the presence of extraterrestrial humanoids was such that he cannot give one concrete answer. He mentioned, Semyonov did, that yes, we know that there are 4 dimensions known to the scientists in nature, but some scientists, well-known scientists, he doesn't mention them, believe that there are more dimensions. And he describes his view of the universe and what's taking place there. But then what's very interesting to us, I'm not going to go into his scientific ruminations, but more practical is this. According to him, he studied the piezoelectrical effect for years, and one of them, according to him, was in 1982, which is a very memorable year, as you know from my lecture in the history of UFO research. He mentioned the Norwegian Hesdalen Valley, and he says that according to his knowledge, the research shows that the mysterious atmospheric phenomena in that area is nothing else but a variety of plasma which can burn in the atmosphere and freely move around under the effect of the electromagnetic streams. And that's what he says could be what UFOs are in other parts of the world. Now, according to him, that some of such phenomena can be man-made. And he mentions that a group of scientists headed by him, that group, developed a very interesting flying apparatus which works under the principles of electromagnetic force through the effect of the dynamic superconductivity. and that's how the thrust is created. And they even had tests of some of them, but he mentioned, Semyonov does, that they don't have enough money to continue, enough funds to continue the research, but apparently somebody else could have developed such flying apparatuses. And of course, according to him, we have to know, meaning in Russia, they have to know what's flying over them just for the reasons of their safety and security. And then he will go into some of the interesting cases that Semyonov revealed. For example, on October of 28 of 1989, there was a very interesting effect of UFO on the radars of the Irkutsk airport. It was so powerful that they had to change the flight routes of some of the passenger aircraft. And he also mentioned that during different years, the radars of the Kharkov airport in Ukraine and some other ones, for example, in the Nizhny Novgorod, also detected presence of the unwanted guests and reported to where they had to report about it. So they knew in the Soviet Union, of course, about such incidents. But then he goes into the description of the area that I often mention in my lectures, one of the most interesting areas in the former Soviet Union. This was the area of Borisogledsk. That's where the UFOs had been sighted and interfered with the flights of the military aircraft. And that's not far from Voronezh, for example. Semyonov says that here, according to the official data, the period from 1974 to 1989, they had hundreds of strange phenomena. And that's true. I can vouch for that too, from my research from different sources. But here are some of them mentioned by Semyonov. On August 9, 1974, the technicians that served military aircraft observed flight of a very unusual white sphere, which left behind it bluish or greenish trail. But the radars just did not react to the presence of the UFO, and the trail disappeared one hour after the flight. But this is the next case is dramatic, and I also mention it too. 1 month later, over the Pavorina airport or airfield, all of a sudden there was a black cloud that appeared out of nowhere. It's just, and of course it wasn't registered on the radio detecting stations, just like two little dots, that all that was registered. Apparently that object was at the height of 7,000 meters, and very large radio frequencies were affected, as if somebody was interfering with the works of the radio stations. There was the local command asked for the interceptor aircraft to check out the UFO, and then when it reached the area where the black cloud was active, something unusual happened. The pilot reported very unusual sound, which was much more than the pain threshold that they could withheld. And the indicator said that in the airplane showed that it was dangerous height for the airplane, and the Soviet aircraft started shaking violently. So the pilots had to actually shut off the engine. When the aircraft finally left this very strange black cloud, the shaking started, the fuel system started working again, and all of the devices aboard the Soviet military airplane started working too. And of course there was no more horrible noise in the helmets. Another case took place in October of 1981 in the area of Kaliningrad, where a military airplane all of a sudden encountered the 5-meter in size fiery sphere, which inside it had some kind of brown center with reddish stains. The UFO, which impacted the Soviet airplane, disappeared a few seconds later. The pilot said that he experienced very unpleasant feelings, and he mentioned that the engine started behaving erratically, and also there was a smell of fire after the object disappeared, although the onboard devices did not show any presence of the fire. Interesting that the airplane itself suffered damage, and the special commission which studied that Su-32 airplane found very unusual impact on it and damage to the technology of the airplane. So this was very interesting, but of course some of the most interesting stories took place in 1990, on March 21st of 1990, in the areas of central Russian cities where there were flights of the gigantic UFO. And I mentioned it before in my books, but it's always interesting to talk about it again, because it was Colonel General of the Soviet aviation, Maltsev, who was in charge of the main staff of the Soviet Air Force. According to the reports that he received, the disk was about 200 meters in diameter, and there were lights pulsating all around it. The trajectory of the flight of the gigantic disk was zigzag-like. The object would rotate around its axis, and sometimes it would hover, and its velocity was 2 or 3 times more than any modern military aircraft. The area of the flight was about, in terms of the height, was about 1 to 7 kilometers in altitude. The flight was not accompanied by any sounds. The impression was, as the general said, that the object was void of any inertia. And this was one of the first, if not the first, admission by Soviet military that the UFOs are a fact and are present in the Soviet Union. But how true was it? Asked Semyonov. I don't think he has questions too. According to him, in modern Russia, there is no organization that studies UFOs at the state level. He mentioned that before the beginnings of the 1990s, the UFOs, or strange phenomena in the atmosphere, was conducted by the so-called Special Laboratory 22 of the Central Scientific Research Testing Institute of the Ministry of Defense of the Soviet Union. But according to Semyonov, because of the economic difficulties and very scant financing from the armed forces, the people in charge of the Soviet military-industrial complex decided to take interest only in the Earth problems, and they cut down the financing, including this laboratory. See, that's different from the Setka program that I told you. I'm sure it's part of the Setka program, but Semyonov does not talk about it. So, according to him, people are interested in the UFOs, of course, but the only ones that do any work are either some UFO organizations, maybe science fiction writers, and charlatans too, but no official government support. That's according to him. In the Soviet Union, he mentions the UFO existence was admitted, but the research was taking place without any noise in the press, so to say, without making sure that the Russian or the Soviet population doesn't know what they don't need to know. Until 1989, by the way, and he says, which I mentioned that too, you couldn't talk about UFOs in the media without the official permission of the Academy of Sciences of the USSR, which was basically doing censorship. And so you couldn't really discuss UFOs in media, and UFO NLO was not a term that you could use. And that's very interesting, but the Red Star newspaper, Krasnaya Zvezda, after conducting this interview with Semyonov, mentioned that veterans of the Soviet Russian Air Force and the Border Guard troops who have information about unidentified flying objects should discuss their experience on pages of Krasnaya Zvezda. There is another very interesting case that Semyonov mentions, and an unusual case. And he wanted to say that, according to him, that the U.S. administration does possess very interesting information about existence of intelligent life in the universe, and is trying to get in touch with it, but secretly, so that the world opinion doesn't know about it. Semyonov is not really asserting anything like that, but he did mention Marina Popovich, who passed away recently, the famous Soviet test pilot who promoted UFO research in her country and beyond the borders. And then Semyonov mentioned very interesting case. He says there was a book that he read about a special facility called Granite, and there was an interesting case in this book, and he wants to talk about it without any commentaries, and the Red Star let him do it, and I think they might have provided more information. Apparently, representatives of the foreign intelligence services were always interested in the so-called Soviet product called 5734. And according to the Krasnaya Zvezda, this was the station for control and receipt of information, one of the objects of a missile attack warning system. But outside of the foreign spies, it was the UFOs that became interested in this product. One of the days in October of 1974, about 9 o'clock at night, 4 so-called chandeliers hovered over the secret facility. Of course, there was panic among the personnel of this secret station or facility. Alarms went out. The city, at that little town, was actually, they were showing a movie at the time, and they stopped showing the movie, and everybody involved with the military station or unit that was guarding the station was now under guard. And from the area of Kubinka, they said interceptor aircraft was dispatched. And all of the watch commanders wrote down in their logs that over the facility you can see hovering bright shining objects, and there are 4 of them. Just before the appearance of this Soviet interceptor aircraft, all of the chandeliers disappeared. What were those chandeliers? It's unknown. Because the next morning, after talking to those who need to talk to the KGB, that's what he means, all of the personnel of the military unit, all of them refuted their observations the day before. Okay? All of the information about the sighting was removed from the logs, and it was forbidden to them to speak about this incident. What is significant to me is that Krasnaya Zvezda talks about such cases, and in the future I'll bring you more information of the sort when it appears on the pages of Krasnaya Zvezda and other publications. Thank you.